Bom dia, pessoal. Bom dia para mais um encontro do IPOL. Hoje temos o prazer de ter conosco a Paula Clerici. A Paula Clerici é doutora em ciência política pela Universidade de Buenos Aires e ela é professora na UBA, Universidade de Buenos Aires, e professora também na prestigiosa Universidade Torquato Di Tella. Ela veio durante uma semana apresentar um ciclo de palestras sobre presidencialismo e federalismo em perspectiva comparada, trazendo justamente a experiência dela, a experiência argentina, mas também mexicana, para que nós possamos refletir aqui no Brasil com visões um pouco diferentes, porém, pero não muito, como diríamos, não? Porque embora sejam países com certas culturas, certas formas, certos partidos distintos, eles em muitos aspectos se comportam de formas parecidas, certo? Então é sempre interessante ter essas visões um pouco de fora, para ver que às vezes o que a gente tende a achar de que são fenômenos brasileiros, na real não é bem assim não, certo? Então temos esse prazer só para recolocar esse evento da Paula se coloca dentro do evento do CAPS Print, que conseguimos junto com a CAPS para trazer pessoal de fora, e hoje temos o imenso prazer de ter conosco a Paula Clerici. Paula, quando tu quieras.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Adrian, for introducing me. I'm going to present today a research project we just published with a colleague from Argentina, Alejandro Bombecchi, that is part of a bigger or larger research agenda we are working on. So let me share a presentation. Okay, just a moment. It's thinking, uploading the presentation. Well, in the meantime, I can tell you that my research agenda is part of the larger process of studying the decision-making influenced by the electoral arena. And so I began to study for my dissertation the electoral coalitions. And then I moved to study the Congress and the legislative studies in Latin America, especially in Argentina. And nowadays I'm moving to slowly to the behavior studies and trying to do synergy between legislative studies, especially legislators' incentives to behavior in the camera or in the chamber, and trying to relate with the voters' incentives to vote and to select representatives, and trying to understand the mechanism behind these two processes. Well, I think you are, is it okay, Adrian? Everyone can see the presentation? Can watch the presentation? I suppose. Okay, thank you. Well, as I told you, this is a research we published with Alejandro Bombecchi. He's a colleague from Universidad Torquato Di Tella and CONICET, the places we work for. That is, we naming this vote switching, and we are trying to compare the system of multi-party and multi-member districts to the typical or the traditional case to study switching, that is the United States Congress. So this is the outline. The main question is, why do legislators switch their vote? Why they change in the middle of the legislative process? They change positions. And mainly we focus between the committee and the roll call votes. I mean, why do legislators change positions on an issue, on a certain issues during the legislative procedure. Based on the US literature, scholars claim that switches are product or are conditional on cross pressure that legislators receive from different competing principles. Typically, the party leader inside the chamber and leaders from different interest groups. Another reason that scholars mention are partisanship, electoral competitiveness, ideology, seniority, informational updates. To what extent these arguments, these effects, explain also other type of systems that are not based on single member districts. So some of the independent variables that these scholars used to take or consider to explain vote switching are also being used in our cases, in our regional cases, to analyze vote switching. But others are different. Why? Well, because the institutional context matters, cultural issues, and some of the political institutions, of course, are resemble or are product of different political movements, right? So we try to understand which of the explanations may apply to our context and what others are acting differently. To put the difference clearly, I mean, the US House, the lower house, is a product of a two-party system, the two main parties. Representatives are elected in single-member districts. This is to say, one representative represents only one constituency. The candidate selection is a decentralized process, and typically the scenario in the chamber is acts or under majority rule. Argentine House is very different, and it resembles other legislatures in our region in Latin America. In our case, we have a multi-party system, multi-member districts that they vary among magnitude. Some provinces, in the case of Argentina, select only 2 or 3 seats in the elections, while the largest province is the province of Buenos Aires, who elect 35 seats each term. Argentina has a renewal of the chamber each 2 years. So we have midterm elections between the presidential term. Our candidate selection mechanism is centralized on parties. And typically, the Congress, the lower house, operates under plurality rule. I mean, there were cases from 1983, but it's not so common, that the president's party control at least the 50% of the seats. So we expect that the informational argument, ideologically, and seniority factors influence switching the same way that it does in the United States. And I'm going to explain all of these theories that are behind. And that the electoral and the partisan variables behave differently in our case. In my country, parties have different degrees of nationalization. The candidates are mainly selected by the subnational party leaders, typically the governors. The governors, if we think in the party that governs the province, but in the case of the opposition parties as well, I mean, typically they are subnational leaders. Of course, and the legislators, once elected, have different alignments then and different principles. They are responsive to different people, right? And these people, the principals, if we follow the Caray's theory, the competing principle theory, have different preferences and opinions related to different bills, right? So we focus the analysis on bills with the highest potential for conflict among competing principles that are those that belong to the president, those that were initiated by the president. But not all the bills are really important or are politically important. We concentrate on bills that are dedicated to tax issues, regulatory bills, institutional, penal, social, economical bills, right? And we don't consider those that are formalities. For example, the president allowed for permission to go out the country to do some duties outside Argentina, or, for example, the president declares a certain day as holiday, or these kind of formalities. Because why do not consider this? In that case, we will have overestimating the support to these bills. So we try to focus on those that are divisive between legislators. We consider 12 two-year Congress. As I mentioned, we have midterm elections, and the chamber is renovating each 2 years. So each Congress lasts 2 years. In the period we consider, there are included different presidents, 6 administrations with different parties, with different and significant variation among the fragmentation in the plenary, the nationalization or denationalization of the party system. So we have variation among parties and contextual and institutional factors. So the switching, wrapping up. I mean, five types of explanations to try to understand why legislators change positions between 2 different steps in the legislative arena: the informational, the ideological, the organizational, the electoral, and the partisan explanation. First of all, the informational argument claims that legislators change position because during the process, the lawmaking process, they are being updated with information. So debates among bills in the committee allow legislators to update information and to listen to the different principles that they are responsive to. So during the process, they update information, they receive more information, so in the meantime, they may alter their preferences. The second explanation is the ideological argument that says that the people, the legislators, who are located in the most extreme positions are less likely to switch, right? Than those who are located in the middle of the dimension that orders the positions in the chamber. Why this? Okay, these extreme legislators are supposed to have strong ideological points, strong values, strong preferences through the different issues, right? Than the moderate ones. So if these extreme legislators change votes or change position, they might be as betrayal to the constituency or to the voters, to the electoral base who support these extreme people. Conversely, the most moderate people are accustomed to make signals of moderation to the electoral basis. The third, the organizational arguments, mention that senior legislators are more likely to switch votes during the procedure than the newbies. Why? Well, these people, generally speaking, have more expertise on the legislative process, have a longer political careers. They know exactly how the formal and the informal rules work in the chamber, in the legislative process. They know how to negotiate. They are accustomed to do it, to negotiate, to log roll. They have more information, more technical expertise to do the job. So they have gained reputation within their party leaders and their constituency, and they have access to different kind of communication with different colleagues because, well, they have more expertise and more ears in the legislative process. So all the things I've been mentioning, we can suppose that provide them leeway to switch their votes. Contrary to the rookies or the newbies are like, all is new. They are trying to do or to gain a place into the process, into the legislative arena. They are trying to gain reputation with or facing the party leader. So the more experienced people are more likely to switch votes. Well, until here, the three more common explanations that we consider that it works the same in the United States and under the proportional system, multi-member districts. What about the electoral explanation and the partisanship explanation? Electoral competitiveness has been argued to be negatively affecting switching, right? The smaller the electoral margin, the difference between the first and the second in an election, the difference is generally measured with the percentage of the proportion of the votes. So the smaller the electoral margin, the higher the likelihood that of switching, of changing voting between the two instances. And this may hurt re-election prospects, and thus the lower the probability of the switching. That's the explanation that these people mentioned there, Spinon-Cannon, Harden and Kirkland, Odom and company, they study and they found evidence that this works this way from the United States. However, in multi-member districts and in multi-party systems, as my country, as in many countries in Latin America, particularly while the district magnitude is increased, while provinces elect more representative at a certain election, more seats, they face competition from across the political spectrum and may therefore seek to capture the marginal seats by accommodating the composition in the candidate list, because there's leeway, because there are many seats to fill, right? That comparing to the smaller districts. Of course, that this dynamic may affect the switching, increasing the likelihood of occurring. So legislators may use these switches, these changing positions, to signal accommodation of diverse positions to voters who may otherwise be prefer to support competitors, right? Vote switching should decrease. Should be less common to change position with the effective number of parties. As legislators that facing less competition would be switching in case of voter punish the inconsistency by abstaining or supporting their majority competitor, right? Where abstaining means going to the session and no voting. What happened with the last of the explanatory variables that typically the literature mentioned? Parties affect vote switching by way of cross-pressuring for complementary carry. Legislators are pressured by different competitive principles. For example, party leaders who control resources in the Congress. What type of resources? Well, the appointments, budgets, campaigning funds, what kind of appointment, typically the chairpersonship of the committees. So legislators are being pressured by party leaders or by other interest groups. For example, their constituency, their voters, and other leaders from different organizations as churches, as industrial or commercial chambers, as why not international pressures? Why? So all these kind of principles that legislators may be responsive to try to force a type of or a certain behavior while in the chamber, right? And these people are all the time voting with inconsistencies, then this fact may damage the reputation. Nevertheless, I mean, this is the argument for United States case. Nevertheless, in our kind of system that works in a more centralized way, why? Because the candidate selection is mostly based on the parties, on the party leaders. They face more different competing principles. In systems with the incongruent pattern of electoral competition across level of governments, as Argentina, for example, parties may have different degrees of nationalization of the votes. Remember the idea of denationalization, contrasting the idea of nationalization. Nationalization of the party system is when the parties, the main parties, typically, obtain more or less the same percentage of votes in the different districts, while in opposition, denationalization, also known as territorialization or decentralization of the party system, means that the main parties obtain different percentage of votes among all the districts. Typically, this is measured in legislative elections, especially for the lower chamber. So Argentina was, for a long time, an example of a denationalized party system. In the last less than 10 years, maybe from 2015, the system is increasingly becoming more nationalized. Of course, as nationalized during the 80s, for example. So these different principles in a party system where the provinces are really strong influence for the voting in the process. These principles have different legislative agendas. So they are being pressured legislators with different preferences and incentives, of course. So most of the legislators may face two comparing principles: national and subnational party leaders, while others may face three comparing principles: national, subnational, and factional leaders, for example. So all of these principles may not have the similar opinions in the bills that are being discussed in the chamber. So our two hypotheses are: legislators from more electorally competitive districts are more likely to switch their votes. Let's remember that more electorally competitive districts mean that the party who obtained the biggest portion of the votes takes a little difference in votes from the second competitor. And the second hypothesis is legislators who belong to parties whose leaders are not politically aligned through the levels of governments are more likely to switch votes between committee report and roll call votes. Let's talk about methodological issues and research design. After a bill is submitted either by the president or by any of the deputies or senators. It's assigned to one or more committees, typically with a limit of 5. And of course, these committees are based, or the committees where the bills are, girado es la palabra in Spanish, are sending to, depends on the matter or the issue of the bill. If within the committee or the committee meetings, a majority emerge, there's a possibility of signing a report. Together, this report with the original bill goes, in the best scenario, to the plenary, right? The bill discussed in the plenary is the bill that receives, eventually, amendments in the committee. So it's not the original version of the bill that is going to be discussed in the plenary, but the bill with amendments. The important issue in Argentina that allows us to develop this research is that we can identify in the committee report individual positions. So each legislator that received these executive bills and decided to discuss and to arrive to some consensus to sign a report may support the president's bill, may support it with dissidencies, that these dissidencies could be total or partial. They may reject the bill, or maybe they are absent at the time that the report is signing in the committee. That means not participating in the meeting. So we follow partially an operationalization that the Spinum canon developed for the United States with some slightly differences that we mentioned in the paper. So our dependent variable is switching, but switching could be measured in 4 different ways. The first is the total switching. I mean, any form of changing positions between the committee report and the roll call vote. The second is the favorable switching. That means if the legislator, if the individual reject the bill or amend the bill in the committee discussion, in the committee scenarios, but they vote for yeah in the plenary. They support the president's bill. The third way of being a switcher is if we consider a negative or an unfavorable switching. I mean, this person support or amend the bill in the committee, and then in the floor, in the roll call, votes nay. No, he rejects the president's bill. And the last way of switching is demobilizing. That means that any form or any behavior these people have in the committee, but then at the moment of the voting in the plenary, he or she abstains or doesn't show. I mean, is absent for the roll call vote. So what are the other independent variables? Electoral competitiveness is the classical indicator by Laxo and Tapera. That means how many important parties are making decisions in the plenary. Not how many, but how many of them are important to decide. The variable for measuring competing principles. Well, we use 3 indicators. One is the type of legislator that I'm going to show a table now in a moment and explain the alignment possibility between different executives. So, type of legislator. sectoral bill is a dummy that gives the value of 1 if the bill is about taxation, economic, or any type of regulation of economic activities or means, let's say, distributive bills. The third is time. We measure the amount of days that go through between the committee report and the roll call votes. So, type of legislator, that is one of our main explanatory variables. We think that we need to capture how the different actors in this puzzle are being positioned one respect to another. So, for us, it's important if the governor is aligned or not to the president. And then it's important if the legislator, the representative, belongs to the same party as his or her governor. So, crossing these two dimensions, we obtain a variable or an indicator with 4 categories, with certain names we give to these categories. And we expect that all of the categories, all of the legislators are more likely to switch votes between committee and plenary comparing to the legislator whose principles are being aligned, are multi-levelly aligned. I mean, if the legislator is aligned with the governor of his or her province, and this governor is aligned to the president. Other variables that we are controlling for this variable that follow in the literature based on the United States. Ideological extremity. We use the classical nominate from Poole and Rosenthal with one of the versions that allows to take the time series or considering a whole period of time. So trying to keep some ideal points of reference, so in order to maintain all the congresses comparable. We follow some colleagues who, instead of taking the individual position, they measure the ideological extremity. How far or how close the legislator is comparing to the plenary median. Seniority, and we use a dummy. Why we use a dummy? This dummy reflects with the value of 1 if the representative was re-elected at least once. Why measuring this in a dummy variable and not in a, for example, numerical variable with the amount of periods or the amount of years being in the seat? Well, because in my country, the re-election is really low. In our sample, more than 66% of the representatives are newbies. So it's not a point to consider the amount of years or the amount of terms, right? Another control variable is the plurality congress, that is a dummy, that gives the value of 1 if the largest party, typically the president's party in my country, doesn't control at least the 50% of the seats. And then we control by how the leader of the bloc or the party votes in the plenary. And why? Well, because Argentina's case is a case of high party discipline. So it's important to control for, I mean, is it feasible to assume that the switching or the eventual switching is being influenced by the way that the party leader votes? So the model. We decided to use logic regression, multi-level, that estimates the probability that a legislator has of switch their vote between committee and roll call votes. This type of model allows to control for for two things. I mean, one is having variables that are being measured at different levels. We have variables that are measured at individual level, at district level, at Congress or contextual levels. Another reason is that our data is nested. We have legislators nested in congresses or periods, right? The 2-year congresses. I'm going to go through the tables until reaching the results, but they are here and we can discuss later during the question moments, and we can analyze the results if you want. We have 12 models, 16 models. But let's go to the results. Following our hypothesis one, our expectation, legislators that came from electoral competitive districts seem to be more likely to switch votes. But not in all cases of switching, but on favorable positions, right? To finally support the president's bill, but having done having done another behavior in committee report. For example, the likelihood increased 17% in districts with 4 effective parties compared to those districts with 2 effective parties. And following the hypothesis 2, the legislators that are national and provincially alike, I mean, that is the baseline, because this variable is measured by qualitative categories. So these legislators whose principles are federalized aligned generally practice less switching than the others, because they are responsive to different principles, but who are aligned. So we can assume that they share positions. The probability of switching for the medium provincially allied is around 25% and decreases until 18% for the medial of the other categories of legislators. What happened with the distributive bills? Those bills whose issues are regulatory, distributive, taxation, economic, etc. Well, the probability of total switching decreases 33% compared to other kind of bills. However, the effect is positive when we interact this dummy with the time elapsed from the committee report to the roll call votes. For example, the idea is that the passage of time, I mean, more days elapsed from one instance to another to manifest a preference, may open the door or to significant changes in the principal's points or preferences or positions, or more pressure, and more pressure from different principals. As expected, changes in bills in committee amendments have a positive impact for the negative switching. I mean, changing position, but finally rejecting the bill in the roll call vote. And this increased the likelihood by 98%, is a lot, compared to those bills that were not amended in the committee moment. It's less likely that legislators switch to a negative position with more time passing from one instance to another if the bill was amended in committee. Contrary to our expectation, that is not, this result doesn't belong to the main hypothesis. However, the result of the evidence was contrary, is that switching is less likely under plurality congresses. However, when no party controls the majority, so under plurality congress, those legislators that are more extreme in the ideological dimension are more likely to switch positions compared to the legislators that have moderate positions, that are located in the middle of the ideological spectrum. We can discuss any of the results or the research design or the theory. I'm open to any of questions or comments or comparison to Brazilian case or whatever that you want to share with me. And thank you for allowing me to present this research.
Wow, what a presentation. Paula, it was a very good presentation of yours. The Argentine case is very interesting, especially when compared to the Brazilian one. I do have several questions. I'm waiting for the audience to write some questions. So, first of all, to which extent we can make the Argentine case flying to generalization? I mean, in other way, with which other case can we compare the Argentine results? Well, your result for Argentina, and how do they explain anything? So how do they transfer in this way? Other thing, I was wondering, you didn't, perhaps you mentioned it and I lose it, but what about the legislators that are coming from local parties? I mean, parties are only present in local states like Frente Patriótico, Jujuy, Cela. Do they have any expectation for switching their vote, or they have no difference with the other cases? And finally, I was wondering if there is any difference between Buenos Aires region and the rest of Argentina, since we know that despite being a federation, Argentina is very centralized towards Buenos Aires capital and Buenos Aires province. So we can expect that these legislators coming from these regions are perhaps more prone to accountability and also to being watched. So is there any switch, any cleavage between the behavior of people from Buenos Aires region and capital and the rest of the country?
Okay. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you. Is it possible to generalize the Argentine case? Well, two things to say. One of them is to replicate this study in other cases, we need to identify individual positions in the committee report. And I know that it's not possible to do this in many countries. So one of the methodological things is that it's possible to study switching, as in the United States, but measuring the first moment with other type of documents or in other moment of the process. For example, in the United States, it's typical to measure switching between co-sponsorship and roll call votes, or to study, they have a system that is slightly different because they have like 2 times of voting. They use roll call to do 2 types of votes in the plenary. So generally they study switching based on these 2 roll calls. So for generalizing this, we need to find data that position legislators in 2 different moments in the legislative procedure. So first of all, it's a methodological thing. And second, suppose that we solve this issue, what about the theory? Well, following the theory based on the United States compared to our findings, I think that Mexico and Brazil could be comparable cases because of the competitiveness, because of the partisan and electoral variables, especially. I don't have proofs to say that, but only expectations based on the knowledge I have of these systems and how they could behave, especially thinking about the comparing principles theory. The second question about the projects, remember that in this piece of research, we only include bills that were presented by the executive. However, we are in the second phase of the project, and we are analyzing, or we are including bills that were presented by deputies or senators as well, and arrived to the lower chamber, and together with the executive bills. So we are putting all together to see what happened with the switching. We have some hypotheses and some preliminary results, and we see that it's more common to do switching in projects that were in or bills that were initiated by legislators than the executive. I mean, it's less common to change position if the bill belongs to the president's agenda. So one of the control variables are going to be what happened with the provincial, the district blocks or the bloques provinciales, the question you asked about what happened with these small local parties with when they offer the bills and when they vote, right? I suspect, we haven't tried this, I suspect that this type of bills are not divisive. Generally speaking, bills that are locally oriented, when they are not distributive, for example, we propose to declare the 2nd of October the day of the chancho asado con pelo, is one of the national festivities in my country, but that gives a lot of economic activity to a municipality. So a lot of festivals are bills that are initiated by these small parties to be connected, to be responsive to the constituency. So stay tuned, because it's the next paper. I hope soon. We are nowadays running models.
What a market, eh? You said it well.
And the third question, what happened with Buenos Aires? As I mentioned, Buenos Aires select or district magnitude is 35 each turn. It means that Buenos Aires has 70 deputies in the chamber. It's huge, although is the contrary of overrepresented.
Underrepresented.
Yeah, thank you. Underrepresented is completely disproportional the amount of seats that Buenos Aires has in the lower chamber compared to the percentage of the population this province represents in the country. More or less, 40% of population lives in the whole province of Buenos Aires, including the suburbs of the city. But they only have 28% of the seats in the lower house. So it's by far the province that suffer most the disproportionality in the Argentinian system. So one thing to say that although this is one of the provinces more competitive because of the district magnitude, so we can say from Buenos Aires that may be located in the hypothesis where we test electoral competitive. In fact, there are many representatives that belong to different parties, different from the 2 or the 3 most important. So there are many small parties that represent the province of Buenos Aires. And what happened with the accountability? Because you mentioned this, there's almost no accountability. Think about this. If you think to do, if you are a voter from Buenos Aires and you had to do accountability to 70 deputies, I mean, it's almost impossible. I live in Buenos Aires city, where our district magnitude is 12 or 13, depends on the turn. And we have 25 deputies in the chamber. And I'm political scientist, and I study legislative issues, and I don't follow the roll call votes of the behavior of the 25. I mean, it's true. So no, accountability is really low. Of course, it's higher in the provinces that only have 5 representatives.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, a nice piece as yours. Well, you know also Mike's obsession with bicameralism. Do you have any pattern of behavior looking at the Senate, and perhaps any different pattern of behavior with senators, or you don't have any data on it?
No, I don't have. And it's a lot of work not to systematize roll call votes, because it's easy. It's almost already done because of the open data that the Congress is managing really well. But for analyzing the committee reports, it's not easy, because sometimes the same people are named with the 2 names and 1 surname. 1 name, 2 surnames. 2 surnames. 2 names, 2 surnames. 1 name and the capital letter of the second name. So if you want to do this with automatization in R with an API or whatever, it's then a mess, because you have to check every fila, because the ID is not corresponding to the same people. So
Sure.
It's a lot of work doing manually this, or controlling manually this. But I could have a hypothesis about the switching in the senator's case, and I would suspect that the switching is less if we compare with the deputies.
Here you get the paper.
Yeah, a lot of work. I need a system. And because of the many things we already discussed these days that are related to the background or political career that senators have compared to deputies. They have longer political careers. They are more experienced people. Generally, many of them were already governors of their provinces. They have larger own political capitals, and not only belonging to the party. They are candidates who concentrate more individual votes than the deputies. And the district magnitude is smaller in general, because every province in my country select 3 senators. So for many reasons, I suspect it would be less likely to find switching, or the probability of switching would be lower than in the case of the deputies.
So here we get Bonvecchi in Clerici 2024.
A long research agenda.
Paula, I do have here a question by Lucas. He says, congratulations for the presentation. He asked that vote switching is less likely frequent for unitary countries than federalist one. Is this because for unitary countries there's no the question of competing principle doesn't exist with the governators?
Following the literature, yes, the explanation could be found in the less amount of competing principles. Not only the number, but also the power or the resources. Maybe in unitary countries, generally is this way, mayors are elected by people, and maybe some legislators are responsive to mayors, although mayors comparatively to those governors in federal countries, are using less resources. They are less powerful in general. So maybe the number of principals could be similar, but not the power. So the cross pressure, they suffer from less cross pressure than legislators that belong to federal countries. Although this is an expectation, right? Another paper. Lucas, another paper. We can write together.
Excellent. So Clerici and Couto 2025. Lovely. Well, I'm looking if there is anything else. For the moment, no. Thank you very much, Paula, for your presentation. Very interesting, very integrating, actually, especially when comparing with the Brazilian case. I hope people have learned many things, because generally speaking, here people don't look at Latin America, they look at North America or Europe. And it's quite interesting when you see that Argentine legislators behave quite similar to the Brazilian one, despite all the differences we can find in two cases. So thank you very much for your presentation. Can you send me in a few minutes a link of your paper, so I can do the diffusion here? And for the rest, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to receive you here in Brasilia, despite that we couldn't meet with many people, but it was a pleasure, and we hope to have you here soon, another time, with print or other things, perhaps for presenting your paper with Lucas. Who knows?
Thank you for the invitation, for having me, for the classes, por la buena onda, and thank you, the students. Thank you in general. And okay, let's keep in touch. With a really pleasure, I would come back. So thank you for everything.
Lovely. Thank you, Paula.
Bye, people.
Have a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you.